The silk of the heavy drapes didn't just block the Chicago skyline, they felt like a velvet shroud closing around a secret I had no business keeping. I had 3 minutes. 3 minutes before the shift change, before the next maid's footsteps would echo down the corridor and someone would notice I'd stayed too long in a room I was only permitted to clean. My fingers found the chip before my courage did. It was smaller than I remembered. Smaller than something that could buy my brother's life back should ever be. I pulled it free from behind the mahogany mirror frame and the shower's rhythm swallowed the sound, that steady, indifferent hiss that had been masking my heartbeat for the last 20 minutes. Then the hiss stopped. I didn't hear his footsteps. I didn't hear the door. I only felt the cold, that particular, weaponized cold that precedes a man who has never once needed to announce himself. I turned. Zenith Cross filled the threshold like a verdict. Charcoal suit. Dark eyes that didn't widen, didn't flinch. Eyes that simply landed on me, on the chip between my fingers, and stayed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was deliberate. Loaded. The kind only power can afford. The Cross estate didn't hire maids. It acquired them. That was the word the man in the gray suit had used when he appeared at our door 14 months ago, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and overdue notices. Acquired. Like we were inventory. Like the Vane family name, what remained of it, had already been itemized, assessed, and assigned a value that had nothing to do with us as people. My father had been dead for 6 weeks. The medical bills had been alive and multiplying for 6 years before that. I remembered standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the black dress from the repast, watching my brother Caden shake the gray suit's hand with the particular desperation of a man who has already said yes before the offer is fully made. He was 24. I was 21. We had a combined savings of $1,100, a house that belonged more to the bank than to us, and a debt attached to our father's name that neither of us fully understood, something old, something inherited, something that had apparently been quietly accruing interest since before we were born. The gray suit explained it the way you explain weather. Matter of fact. Inevitable. Our father, in a moment of catastrophic judgment 20 years prior, had borrowed from the Cross family. Not from a bank. Not from anyone with a complaint form or a mediation process. From them. The debt had been restructured twice, forgiven partially once, and then called in full the moment our father's obituary ran in the Tribune. The Cross family sent their condolences and their accountant in the same week. The number on the paper the gray suit slid across our kitchen table had too many digits for a kitchen table conversation. Caden had looked at me across that table with an expression I had never seen on his face before and have never been able to forget since. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the face of someone watching a door close and understanding, with total clarity, that they put their hand on the wrong side of it. 2 years, the gray suit said. Service in the estate offsets the principal. Standard terms. There was nothing standard about any of it. But I was the one who said yes. Caden's mouth had opened, probably to negotiate, probably to protest. My brother had always been better at righteous anger than I was, and I put my hand flat on the table and said yes before he could make it worse. That was 14 months ago. The Cross penthouse on the 58th floor of a building that didn't appear on any public registry had been my entire world since March. I knew its rhythms the way you come to know the rhythms of any cage, which hallways were monitored, which rooms were locked even to cleaning staff, which hours Zenith Cross kept and which hours he disappeared entirely, as though a man that size could simply cease to exist between midnight and 4 a.m. I was good at being invisible. That was the thing none of them anticipated. I was small, quiet, methodical. I folded towels with military precision and polished surfaces until they forgot they'd ever had fingerprints. The other staff barely registered me. The security team cycled through faces too quickly to build habits around mine. And Zenith Cross himself, in 14 months, had looked through me exactly the way the very powerful look through the very necessary. Without malice. Without interest. The way you don't notice the elevator until you need it. I had counted on that. Caden had counted on it more. The calls had started 4 months in. First, they were careful, my brother asking about my adjustment, my comfort, whether the work was hard. Then the carefulness wore thin the way it always does when money is involved, and the real conversation surfaced. There's something in his private quarters, L. A chip. Obsidian casing, small enough to miss. It's what he's holding over us, over all the families. It's not just debt. It's documentation. Evidence. Leverage he keeps on every family that owes him. If you get it, we're not just free. Everyone is. I had told him no. 3 times. With decreasing conviction. The 4th call came on a Sunday. Caden's voice was different, compressed, like he was speaking from inside something smaller than a room. He told me he'd made contact with someone. That he'd been asking questions he shouldn't have been asking. That the wrong people had noticed. How wrong? I asked. The pause before his answer was its own answer. I started paying attention differently after that. Not to the penthouse's luxury. I had long since become numb to the obscenity of that much beautiful space existing for one largely absent man, but to the private quarters. The schedule. The security rotation on Thursday nights when Zenith attended what the staff referred to only as the council meeting and never elaborated on. It took me 6 weeks to find the chip. It was exactly where Caden said it would be, tucked behind the mahogany vanity mirror in the master suite, unremarkable against the dark wood unless you knew to look for something that didn't belong. I had pressed my fingers against it on a Thursday 3 weeks ago and then pulled my hand back like I'd touched something burning. I stood in that room for 45 seconds, I counted, and then I straightened the mirror, picked up my polished cloth, and walked out. I told myself I needed more time. More certainty. A better plan. What I needed was to stop hearing Caden's compressed voice in my sleep. The call 2 nights ago had not been from Caden. It had been from a number I didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end had been calm and unhurried in the specific way that people are calm when they hold everything you love in one hand. Your brother is a guest of ours, the voice said. He'll stay comfortable as long as you're cooperative. You have 72 hours. I hadn't slept since. I had spent those hours moving through the penthouse on autopilot, polishing, folding, straightening, while something cold and mechanical took over the part of me that was still afraid. Fear, I had discovered, has a ceiling. Past a certain point it simply converts to function. To calculation. To the specific focus of someone who has run out of alternatives. Thursday came around again. Council meeting. Security rotation. 22 minutes of running water. I told myself it was simple. Get in, get the chip, get out before the shift change. Deliver it. Get Caden back. Finish the 2 years. Disappear. I had told myself a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. Standing now in the master suite with the chip between my fingers and Zenith Cross filling the doorway like a verdict I hadn't finished reading, I understood, with the particular, devastating clarity of someone whose plan has just met reality, that I had miscalculated every single variable. Except one. He hadn't called for security yet. He didn't move. That was the first thing I catalogued, the absolute stillness of him. Most dangerous things announce themselves. They raise their voice, or their hand, or they close the distance between you and them with the particular urgency of something that needs to prove its power. Zenith Cross did none of that. He simply stood in the threshold and let the silence do the work, and somehow that was worse than anything I had prepared myself for. My fingers tightened around the chip. You've been here 14 months, he said finally. Not a question. A file being opened. My mouth was dry. Yes. Low and vain. Still that same register, low, unhurried, the voice of a man narrating something that had already concluded. Your father borrowed $2.3 million in 2003. Restructured in 2009. The estate absorbed the remaining principal as a service arrangement. His eyes hadn't left my face. You've been exemplary. The word landed like a blade laid flat against skin. Not cutting. Demonstrating. I can explain, I started. You were going to steal from me. He said it the way you say it rained yesterday. Plainly. Without heat. That's not something that requires explanation. It requires a decision. He stepped into the room then, and I understood immediately that every inch of space he crossed was space I was losing. I held my ground because there was nowhere to go, the vanity was at my back, the window beyond its 60 floors of open air, and because moving felt like conceding something I couldn't name. He stopped 4 feet away. Close enough that I could see the precise line of his jaw, the single chain at his collar disappearing beneath his shirt. He smelled of cedar and something darker. Something that had no consumer equivalent. His eyes dropped to my hand. To the chip. Put it on the vanity. I won't ask again. I put it on the vanity. He didn't pick it up. He didn't even look at it again. He looked at me, with the focused patience of someone conducting an experiment they already know the result of, and said, "Who sent you?" Not "Did someone send you?" Who? My stomach dropped through the floor. No one, I said. I found out about it on my own. I needed. Your brother's name is Caden Vane. 24 years old. Graduate of DePaul, 2 semesters short of finishing. He's been making inquiries through 3 intermediaries over the last 4 months. He paused. He's not a careful man. The cold that moved through me then had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Where is he? I said. It came out flatter than I intended. Less like a question than a wound being pressed. Safe. Zenith's eyes didn't soften. But they didn't harden either. They simply held. For now, that's entirely contingent on this conversation. I hated how steady his voice was. I hated that I was in a towel, damp-haired, holding nothing, while he stood there in $4,000 of charcoal wool looking like the concept of consequence made flesh. The power differential was so absolute it had its own gravity. What do you want? I asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, I didn't think this man trafficked in warmth, but something adjacent to interest. Like I'd answered a question he hadn't asked aloud. Sit down, he said. I'd rather. Eloan. My name in his mouth was a different word than it had ever been. 2 syllables that landed like a hand on a shoulder, not violent, not gentle. Just there. Immovable. Sit down. I sat on the edge of the bed because it was the only surface available and because my legs had made the decision before my pride could override them. He moved to the window. Stood with his back partially to me, looking out at Chicago's grid of lights 58 floors below, and for a moment I had the absurd, vertigo-inducing thought that he was the only thing in the room taller than the city. The chip, he said, contains documentation that implicates 17 families in activities that would interest federal prosecutors across 4 jurisdictions. It is also the only existing record of what those families owe me, and what I owe them. He turned slightly. If it leaves this room, I am exposed. If I am exposed, so are they. And 17 families with federal heat and nothing left to lose are a problem that tends to resolve itself through bodies. I stared at him. You are going to carry that out of here, he continued, hand it to whoever has your brother, and trust that they would use it responsibly. The almost pause before responsibly was the closest thing to contempt I'd heard from him. You would have been dead before you reached the lobby. You don't know that. I know exactly who has your brother. He turned fully then. They contacted you 72 hours ago. They gave you a deadline. They have no intention of honoring whatever they promised you in exchange because you are not the objective. I am. He let that settle. You were the method. The room felt smaller. I thought about the voice on the phone. It's particular, practiced calm. The way it had given me just enough information to act but not enough to think. So what happens now? I said. My own voice surprised me, steadier than I felt. Something in me had apparently decided that if I was going to be destroyed, it would be destroyed upright. Zenith picked the chip up from the vanity. Turned it once between his fingers. Set it in his jacket pocket with the same economy of motion he seemed to apply to everything. You stay, he said. I blinked. I'm sorry. In this room. Until I've managed the situation with your brother and neutralized the immediate threat to this floor's security, you don't leave. He said it without cruelty and without apology. You're not a prisoner. You're a liability I don't have the margin to leave unsupervised. You can't just. You broke into my private quarters and attempted to steal the single most dangerous piece of intelligence in my possession. He looked at me steadily. I can do considerably more than this, and we both understand that. The fact that I'm not should tell you something about how I've assessed your value. Your value. The phrase crawled across my skin. And my brother? Will be returned when I'm ready to return him. He moved toward the door, and the sheer efficiency of it, the way he simply closed conversations by ceasing to participate in them, made something fierce ignite behind my sternum. He's not yours to return, I said. He's not a thing. Zenith paused at the threshold. Turned his head just enough that I caught his profile against the corridor light, that jawline, that absolute composure. No, he said. He's not. A beat. Neither are you. But you're both under my protection now, whether you've chosen it or not. He pulled the door almost closed behind him. The lock engaged with a sound so quiet it was almost polite. I sat in the enormous silence of Zenith Cross's bedroom, in his air, surrounded by his things, wearing nothing but a towel and the wreckage of my plan, and understood, with total and devastating clarity, that I had just traded one cage for another. The difference was this one had better furniture. And a far more dangerous keeper. He came back at 2 a.m. bleeding. I knew it was 2 a.m. because I had been watching the city's grid of lights shift through the floor-to-ceiling window for 6 hours, cataloging the way Chicago dims and brightens in cycles like something breathing, counting down minutes as though time were a resource I could conserve. I had not slept. I had not changed. Someone had left a folded set of clothes outside the door at some point, dark linen trousers and a simple shirt that probably cost more than my monthly wage, and I had put them on because the alternative was the towel, and I needed whatever dignity remained available to me. I heard him before I saw him. Not his footsteps, those were still near silent, that same controlled economy of motion. What I heard was his breath. The particular, disciplined irregularity of someone managing pain with the same focus they apply to everything else. Containing it. Refusing to let it be louder than necessary. The door opened and he was inside before I had fully processed that he wasn't the same man who had left. The charcoal suit jacket was gone. His shirt, black, which had been merciful in its concealment, had a darkness spreading from below his left shoulder that wasn't fabric. He held himself at a precise angle, the kind of angle that is never accidental, the kind that means one side of your body has issued a directive that the other side is only barely complying with. His eyes found me immediately. Whatever calculation lived permanently behind them ran its assessment and apparently concluded I was contained, because he moved past me toward the bathroom without a word. I should have stayed where I was. You're shot, I said. Grazed. He didn't stop moving. That's not a small distinction, that's not. I was already following him, which my better judgment noted and my feet ignored entirely. Let me see it. He turned in the bathroom doorway with an expression I hadn't encountered on him before. Not quite irritation. Something more like surprise that had been rapidly reclassified. You're not a nurse. My father was sick for 6 years, I said. I dressed wounds, managed drains, monitored vitals in a living room because we couldn't afford the overnight stays. I met his eyes and held them, which cost me something but felt necessary. I know what a graze looks like versus what needs a hospital, and I know what happens to men like you in hospitals. So let me see it. A long moment. The kind he used as instruments. Then he turned and sat on the edge of the bathtub, and I understood this was as close to compliance as he was architecturally capable of, and I moved forward before he could reconsider. The shirt had to come off. I said so. He reached for the buttons himself, and I noticed, catalogued, filed, tried to immediately unfocus, the breadth of his shoulders, the lean architecture of someone who maintained their body the way they maintained everything else. Deliberately. Without excess. The tattoos began at his left forearm and continued up and over his shoulder, dark geometric patterns interrupted by what looked like Hangul script along his ribs that I didn't read and didn't ask about. The wound was below his left shoulder blade. Long, shallow on one end, deeper on the other. A graze that had committed more seriously than it intended. You need stitches, I said. I need it cleaned and closed. Those aren't the same. Eloan. My name again, in that register. The kit is under the sink. I found it. Black case, professional grade, the kind of medical supply that doesn't come from a pharmacy. I opened it on the vanity and made an inventory and did not say what I was thinking, which was that a man who keeps a kit like this under his bathroom sink has needed it before. Multiple times. Has anticipated needing it again. I worked in silence for a while. Cleaned the wound with the focus of someone who needed something concrete to do with their hands, their thoughts, the excess fear still metabolizing in their bloodstream. He didn't flinch. Not once, through the antiseptic, through the closure strips I pressed along the worst of it, through the bandaging. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees and breathed with that same controlled discipline, and the only evidence of any internal event at all was the single moment when my fingers pressed too firmly against the deepest point and his jaw tightened, just fractionally, like a cable under load. What happened? I asked. Quietly. Not a demand. The question that surfaces when you've been in physical proximity to someone's pain long enough that the boundary between professional and human becomes theoretical. He was quiet long enough that I assumed he wouldn't answer. The council meeting, he said finally. Someone communicated our route. Someone inside? That's the only inside there is. I smoothed the last piece of tape down and didn't move away immediately. My hands were still at his back, not quite touching, hovering in the space where the task had just ended. The bathroom was small enough that the steam and cedar and something copper underneath made the air feel closer than it was. Made him feel closer than he was. Why didn't you have someone else do this? I asked. You have staff. Security. They don't know I'm back. I absorbed that. You didn't want them to know you were hurt. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I moved then, rinsing my hands at the sink, creating space because the alternative was standing in it, which felt like a threshold of a different kind. I looked at him in the mirror. He was looking at the floor with the particular expression of someone allowing themselves, in private, a single unguarded moment. Just one. The mask not removed but slightly, briefly, adjusted. It was the most human I had seen him. It frightened me more than the stillness had. You should sleep, I said. Blood loss makes decisions worse. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. The structural suggestion of one. Is that your medical assessment? It's common sense. He stood, slowly, and the full height of him reorganized the room's proportions again. He reached past me for his shirt, ruined, unwearable, and dropped it in the bin without ceremony, and pulled a fresh one from the back of the door with the ease of a man who keeps contingencies everywhere. I watched him work the buttons one-handed, favoring the left with the automatic accommodation of someone redistributing effort without thinking about it. You could have left, he said. Not looking at me. While I was incapacitated. The window between when I walked in and when I was seated. You could have made a calculation. I hadn't, and we both knew it. Why? He asked. I looked at his reflection in the mirror. At the dark eyes that were watching mine now, the question in them genuine in a way that nothing else about him had been tonight. Because you were bleeding, I said. And I was the only one who knew. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked away, and something in the set of his shoulders was fractionally different than it had been before, not softer, exactly. Something more precise than soft. Something like a door not closed all the way. Get some sleep, he said quietly. This time it wasn't an order. That was the part that stayed with me, long after the lights went out and the city breathed below us and the silence settled over the penthouse like a held breath. He had said it like a person. The boxes arrived on a Wednesday. I knew it was Wednesday because I had started marking time in the small, private ways available to someone who no longer has a schedule, a scratch in the margin of the notepad on the nightstand, a window check at the hour when the light off the lake turned a particular shade of bronze. 5 days since the bathroom. 5 days since I had pressed my hands against Zenith Cross's wound and watched something unguarded move through his expression like weather across an open field. 5 days of existing in the suspended unreality of his penthouse, not quite a prisoner, not quite anything with a name I recognized. The boxes were ivory. No branding on the outside. The kind of packaging that has transcended the need to advertise. There were 11 of them. A member of the house staff, a woman named Petra who had the careful eyes of someone paid to observe and the careful mouth of someone paid not to comment, carried them in with 2 others and arranged them along the sitting room wall without looking at me directly. I was cross-legged on the window seat in the linen trousers that had become my default, a book open in my lap that I had not been reading, and I watched this procession with the specific wariness of someone who has learned that gifts in this world are not gifts. They are architectures of obligation. Petra set a cream envelope on top of the largest box and left without a word. I didn't open it immediately. I looked at it for a while from across the room the way you look at something that is going to change the shape of your day and you are not yet ready for your day to change shape. Then I unfolded myself from the window seat and crossed the room and picked it up. The handwriting was precise. Dense. The kind produced by someone who learned penmanship as a discipline rather than a convenience. You will be required to appear at a function on Friday. The uniform is no longer appropriate. Z. That was it. No question. No explanation. The function of punctuation in the sentences of powerful men, full stop, world rearranged, moving on. I opened the largest box first. The gown inside was the color of deep water. Not blue exactly, something between midnight and the memory of midnight, with a structure at the bodice that suggested it had been built rather than sewn. I lifted it from the tissue and the fabric moved the way expensive fabric moves, with a weight and a whisper, as though it understood its own value. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever held. It was also, unmistakably, armor. The other boxes contained more. Dresses in shades that suggested someone had paid very close attention, deep burgundy, ivory, a black that was not the same black as ordinary black. Day clothes and fabrics that had no right to be that soft. Shoes that fit with an accuracy that unsettled me, because accurate sizing requires measurement, and I had never been measured. The last box contained a card separate from the first. Petra has your schedule for alterations. Be ready at 7 Friday. The staff have been informed of your new standing. New standing. I was still holding the card when Zenith appeared in the doorway, not the bedroom doorway, the main entrance to the suite, which meant he had been somewhere outside these rooms, which meant the world had continued to exist and arrange itself without my participation. He was in slate gray today. No tie. The top button of his shirt open, which on him read less like casualness than like a concession to the hour. His eyes moved across the room. Across the open boxes, the tissue paper, the gown I'd laid across the back of the chair. Then to me. "They fit," he said. Observation, not question. "I haven't tried them on." "They'll fit." I set the card down on the table with more precision than the gesture required. "You had my measurements. I had everything in your file the day you arrived." He moved into the room without invitation, which was consistent with a man who treated all space as fundamentally his. He poured 2 fingers of something amber from the decanter on the sideboard and didn't pour a second glass, which I noted and filed. "The uniform is a liability. It signals your position." "My position," I said carefully, "is that I'm a maid." He turned then. Looked at me with that particular directness that had stopped feeling like aggression and started feeling like something I didn't have clean language for. "Your position," he said, "is that you know what's on that chip. You've been inside this suite unsupervised for 14 months, and the people who took your brother believe you're leverage against me." A pause. "Which means you are leverage. Mine, specifically, before anyone else decides to formalize the arrangement less politely." The words sat in the room between us. "I'm not a prop," I said. "No." He agreed to it so immediately it almost disarmed me. "You're not. But you are safest when the people watching this building see someone they can't categorize as disposable." His eyes moved briefly, very briefly, to the gown on the chair. "A maid is disposable. The woman standing beside me at the Alderton event on Friday is considerably less so." I looked at him for a long moment. At the composure, the precision, the absolute economy of a man who said exactly what he intended and never one syllable more. "And what do I get?" I asked. "In exchange for becoming your leverage?" Something shifted. That fractional adjustment, the cable under load. "Your brother is in a safe house on the north side," he said. "He's been there since Monday. He doesn't know you're here, and for the moment that's protective rather than cruel." He set the glass down. "When Friday is done and I understand the scope of who's watching, I'll arrange contact." My chest did something complicated. Relief moving through a narrow passage. "You already moved him," I said. "Tuesday morning. 2 days ago." While I had been marking time in scratches on a notepad and pretending to read, Caden had already been lifted out of whatever darkroom the syndicate had kept him in, and I hadn't known, and Zenith hadn't told me until now, and I couldn't decide if that was a cruelty or a kindness or simply the way a man operates when information is currency and he never spends it before he has to. "You should have told me," I said. "You would have wanted to go to him." "Yes. And that would have told anyone watching exactly how to reach me." He looked at me steadily. "So no. Not yet." I hated the logic of it. Hated more that I could not find the flaw in it. I picked up the deep water gown from the chair. Held it. Felt the weight of what it actually was, not a dress, not a gift. A new set of walls. More beautiful than the last ones. More dangerous for being beautiful. "You aren't a servant anymore," he said from behind me, quiet and even. "You're my leverage. The distinction matters more than you currently understand." I didn't turn around. "And when it's over?" I asked. "When the chip is neutralized and the syndicate backs down and Caden is safe." "What am I then?" The silence that followed was the longest he had given me. "Ask me on Saturday," he said finally. He left before I could, which I was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through every room, arriving on his own terms, departing on his own terms, leaving the air rearranged and slightly thinner than it had been before. I stood holding a midnight blue gown in a penthouse that wasn't mine, wearing clothes that weren't mine, playing a role that hadn't been offered so much as assigned. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. The name came to me through Petra, delivered with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything. Dorian Voss was coming for dinner. She said it the way you say there will be rain on Thursday, factually, without editorial, with the implicit understanding that weather is not negotiable and neither is this. She said it while fastening the back of the deep-water gown with the practiced efficiency of someone who has dressed women for rooms they were afraid to enter, and she did not look at my face in the mirror, which told me she already knew what my face was doing. "Who is he?" I asked. "Mr. Cross's guest." She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from my hip and stepped back. "Petra." A pause. The brief negotiation of someone weighing the cost of information against the cost of silence. "He runs the Eastern Territories," she said finally. "He and Mr. Cross have an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "The kind," she said carefully, "that requires maintenance." She left me with that. Zenith appeared 20 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway of the sitting room, that threshold he seemed to use as a staging ground, a place to assess before committing, and whatever calculation ran behind his eyes when he looked at me in the gown took longer than usual to complete. Something in the duration of it moved through my skin like a current. "He's going to ask about you," he said. Moving into the room, adjusting his cufflink with the focused attention of a man redirecting himself. Voss collects information the way other men collect assets. He'll probe. He'll be charming about it, he's always charming about it, and the charm is the point. Don't mistake it for safety. What does he want to know? Whether you're real. He looked up. Whether what exists between us is real. Which would tell him whether I have a vulnerability he can price. The word vulnerability in his mouth applied to me landed strangely. I filed it in the category of things to examine later, when I had privacy and distance and could afford to think clearly. "What does real look like?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to where I stood and stopped close enough that the cedar and something darker scent of him reorganized the air immediately around me. He lifted his hand and adjusted something at my collarbone, the neckline, a fold of fabric, with 2 fingers and the absolute economy of a man performing a task. Except that his fingers paused, just briefly, at the base of my throat. Not quite resting. Not quite withdrawn. "Like you can't decide," he said quietly, "whether you want to stay in the room or step closer." My pulse did something I chose not to acknowledge. "I can do that," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Almost." "I know." Dorian Voss arrived at 8 with 2 men who stayed at the door and a smile that arrived before the rest of him. He was handsome in the way of something designed to be looked at, golden-toned, easy in his body, wearing his suit the way men wear things they know they look good in. His eyes were a very pale gray and they moved across the room with a speed and appetite that his smile entirely contradicted. They found me immediately. "You didn't mention," he said to Zenith, with the warmth of a man genuinely delighted, "that you'd acquired a reason to stay home." Zenith's hand found the small of my back. Light. Deliberate. The specific pressure of something being communicated to an audience of one. "Eloan," he said, and something in the way he said my name, different from every other time, warmer by a precise, calibrated degree, made the room feel like a stage I had just walked to the center of. I smiled at Dorian Voss the way a woman smiles at someone she is not threatened by because she already knows where she stands. I had spent 14 months invisible. I understood, suddenly and with complete clarity, that the inverse required almost no effort at all. Just the decision to be seen. "He mentioned you," I said to Voss. I let the implication arrange itself, that I had been mentioned, that I was in possession of information, that I was the kind of woman a man like Zenith talked to. Voss's pale eyes sharpened with interest. "Did he?" "Briefly," I said, and turned to Zenith with an expression I had not planned but which arrived naturally, compounded from 5 days of closed doors and cedar and a hand that had paused at my throat. Something fond and complicated and not entirely performed. "You know how he is." Something moved across Zenith's face. Quick. Private. Gone. Dinner was theater with better cutlery. Voss worked the conversation the way Petra had implied, smoothly, circuitously, with the patience of someone who understands that the most useful information always surfaces sideways. He asked how we'd met. He asked how long. He asked what I did before, watching my face at before the way a man watches a door he expects to open. I answered each question from the position of a woman with nothing to explain, which required constructing a version of the truth close enough to stand on. We met through the estate. I had been there long enough that long enough was its own answer. Before didn't matter because now made it irrelevant. Zenith barely spoke. He didn't need to. His hand returned to my back at intervals, at the moments when Voss's questions sharpened, at the moments when my answer required weight behind it. Each time the pressure was different. Once a warning. Once something steadier, that I couldn't categorize as anything transactional without being dishonest with myself. Voss leaned back after dessert with the expression of a man completing an assessment. "You seem settled," he said to Zenith, with a lightness that meant something heavier. "I'll admit I didn't expect it." "People surprise you," Zenith said. Voss looked at me. "They do." A smile. All surface, no warmth. "How do you find him?" "Honestly. Men like Zenith, we're not easy." I felt Zenith go very still beside me. The particular stillness of someone who has put something in motion and is now watching it either land or fail. I looked at Voss across the candlelight and let the silence breathe for one beat. 2. The length of time that transforms an answer into a confession. "Honestly?" I said. I stopped trying to find him. I just stayed. The stillness beside me changed quality. Voss studied me for a long moment with those pale, expensive eyes. Then he laughed, genuine, surprised, the first real sound he'd made all evening. "Well," he said, lifting his glass toward Zenith, "she's either completely real or completely extraordinary." He paused. "Either way, I'd keep her close." Zenith's hand pressed once, gently, against my back. "I intend to," he said. The rest of the evening passed without incident, which I understood was the goal, which I understood I had delivered. Voss left before 10 with his two silent men and his pale eyes still running calculations I couldn't see the shape of. Petra began clearing the table with the swift, merciful efficiency of someone erasing evidence. Zenith and I stood in the sitting room in the aftermath of it, the candles burning low, the city doing its patient glittering beyond the glass, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. "You didn't tell me what to say," I said finally. "No. You trusted me to find it." He looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize, that fractional opening, that door not fully closed. It lasted exactly as long as he allowed it to, and then he looked away toward the window and the city that belonged to him in some structural and terrible way. "You said you stopped trying to find me," he said quietly. "That you just stayed." "It worked," I said carefully. A pause. "Yes," he said. "It did." He didn't ask whether I'd meant it. I didn't offer an answer to the question he hadn't asked. But the space between us, standing in the low light of that enormous room, felt different than it had at the beginning of the evening. Something in it had shifted without permission. Without announcement. The way foundations move. Slowly, and then all at once. I found it by accident. That seemed to be the organizing principle of my life inside the Cross penthouse: discovery through accident, revelation through the wrong door, understanding arriving sideways and uninvited. I had found the chip by accident. I had found the medical kit. I had found, somewhere between a dinner party and a question I hadn't been asked directly, something in myself that I didn't have clean language for yet. The file was in the study. Zenith had left early that morning. I heard the suite door at 5:43, the near-silent closing of it that had become as familiar to me as the lake light through the drapes, and I had moved through the penthouse in the particular freedom of his absence, which felt less like relief each day and more like a room with something missing from it. I was looking for a book. The study had bookshelves, floor to ceiling on 2 walls, the kind that suggested genuine reading rather than decoration. I had been in the study twice before, always with purpose, always briefly. The books were organized with the same precision Zenith applied to everything, not alphabetically, but thematically, in a logic that revealed itself slowly as I ran my fingers along the spines. The folder was on the corner of the desk. Not hidden. Not displayed. Simply present, the way objects are present on the desks of people who live alone and have no reason to conceal things from themselves. I would have walked past it entirely except that my father's name was on the tab. Vane, Edmund R., Medical. Ongoing. I stood very still for a moment. The study was quiet. Outside, Chicago was beginning its morning assembly, the low frequency of the city finding its rhythm, but in here, in the cedar and parchment silence of Zenith's private space, the only sound was something rearranging itself in my chest. I opened the folder. The documents inside were organized chronologically. The earliest was dated April 2019. My father's first hospitalization, the one we had called a scare, the one that turned out to be the beginning of the long, expensive unraveling of his health. I remembered that April with the specific texture of crisis, the fluorescent waiting room, the coffee from a machine that tasted like burnt wire, Caden's knee bouncing beside mine for 6 hours while we waited for someone to tell us something we could hold on to. We had paid that bill. I remembered paying it. The account had been cleared. I turned the page. The second hospitalization. October 2019. Cleared. The third. March 2020. The long one, 11 days, the one that had required the specialist, the one whose bill had arrived in an envelope so thick I had stood at the mailbox for a full minute before opening it. The number inside had been large enough to produce a specific, physical sensation, a kind of white noise behind the eyes. Cleared. Payment routed through a numbered account. I sat down in Zenith's chair because my legs had made that decision again without consulting me. Page after page. Every hospitalization. Every specialist invoice. Every prescription account that had run past what our insurance would cover, which toward the end was most of them. Cleared, 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 routed, redirected, absorbed. A financial history of my father's illness, annotated in someone else's hand, paid in full by money that had never come from us. At the back of the folder was a single sheet, separate from the rest. A summary. The total figure at the bottom had enough digits that I counted them twice. Beneath the total, in Zenith's precise, dense handwriting, debt offset. Not charity. I sat with that for a long time. The morning moved around me. The light off the lake changed from bronze to white. I heard Petra somewhere in the penthouse, the distant sound of her efficiency, and I didn't move. I sat in Zenith Cross's chair with my father's medical history in my hands and attempted to construct a version of events that made sense. The debt. The $2.3 million our father had borrowed in 2003. Restructured twice, forgiven partially once, called in at his death. I had understood the arrangement as extraction, the Cross family recouping what was owed through labor, through service, through the quiet humiliation of a family working off what they couldn't repay in money. I had not understood it as a ledger being actively maintained in both directions. I thought about 6 years of my father's illness. The bills we had paid, which we had paid genuinely, which had cost us the house in increments and Caden's final semesters and the small savings account I had built through 3 jobs in my early 20s. We had paid what we could. We had assumed the rest was debt accruing, interest compounding, the number growing larger and more impossible in some office we would never see. We had not known someone was paying the rest. We had not known the man whose name we owed was quietly settling invoices through numbered accounts and calling it an offset rather than a kindness because he apparently could not afford, structurally, constitutionally, to call it what it was. I heard the suite door. 5:43 he had left. It was now 9:30. He moved through the penthouse with his usual silence and found me in the study with the folder open in my lap, and he stopped in the doorway with an expression I had never seen on him. Not guilt exactly. Something more complex than guilt. Something that had been managed for a long time and was now in a room with the person it had been managed around, and that required a different kind of composure than the ones he usually deployed. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. "You were going to let me believe it was only debt," I said finally. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Not accusatory. Something rawer than accusation. "It was debt," he said. "You paid my father's medical bills." I offset the principal through an alternative. Zenith. His name in my mouth stopped him the way my name in his mouth had stopped me, 3 times now, with that particular gravity. He closed his mouth. "You paid for the specialist in 2021. The one who gave him 8 more months." My throat tightened around the arithmetic of it. "We had 8 more months with him because of you." He looked at me from the doorway with those dark eyes that held everything and released so little. The composure was still there. But something beneath it was visible the way bones are visible, not seen but sensed. The structure of something. "He was sick before the debt was relevant," he said finally. "The debt was a separate matter. You kept them separate." "Yes." "Why?" A long pause. The kind that in another man I might have read as evasion, but in him I had learned to read as the actual processing of a question he had not previously permitted himself to answer. "Because you would have felt it as a chain," he said. "Another obligation. Another thing you owed." Something moved through his expression, quiet and irreversible. "You had enough of those." I looked down at the folder in my hands. At my father's name on the tab, Edmund R. Vane, rendered in the filing system of a man who had been paying for his survival without telling a single person, who had structured it as an offset rather than a gift because he understood, with the particular precision of someone who watches people carefully, that the Vane family's pride was one of the few things they had left and he was not going to be the one to take it. Something I had been holding in my chest since March, some cold, load-bearing thing that I had named hatred because hatred was structurally useful and kept me oriented, shifted. Not dissolved. Not replaced. Shifted. Moved into a different configuration that I didn't have a word for yet. Something that was not hatred and was not the other thing and was possibly, uncomfortably, the space between them where real things grow. I closed the folder. Set it carefully on the desk. Stood up from his chair and moved toward the door where he still stood and stopped close enough that I had to look up to meet his eyes. "Thank you," I said. Simply. Without architecture around it. His jaw moved once. Something he chose not to say. Then, very quietly, Don't thank you. Don't look at me like that." His voice was low. Even. The voice he used when something required more control than usual to contain. It makes things complicated. I looked at him for one more moment. At the man who had taken my freedom and paid for my father's life and called it accounting and stood in doorways rather than crossing them because he understood, perhaps better than I did, where crossing them would lead. "I know," I said softly. I stepped past him into the hall. Behind me, I heard him release a breath. Slow. Controlled. The sound of something being put carefully back in its place. It didn't sound like it fit as well as it used to. The call came on a Thursday. Not from the same number as before, they were too careful for that, but the voice was the same. That particular, practiced calm. The kind cultivated in rooms where outcomes are decided before conversations begin, where the performance of reasonableness is simply another instrument of control. I was in the sitting room when my phone lit up. Zenith was in the study. The penthouse had developed its own internal geography over the past weeks, its own unspoken cartography of where we each existed and how close those territories had begun to drift. I noted the unknown number and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I answered. We've been patient, the voice said. No preamble. No greeting. Patience deployed as a threat, which is the only way people like this deploy virtues. That speaks well of us, we think. My hand tightened on the phone. Where is my brother? Comfortable. For now. A pause timed with surgical precision. We had an arrangement, Eloan. You've allowed yourself to become distracted. I've been managed, I said. You know that. You know I don't have access to. You have more access than you did 6 weeks ago. The voice was still pleasant. Still unhurried. We've been watching the windows, the arrivals, the dinners. You've made yourself indispensable. Another pause. Use it. My mouth was dry. I can't just take it. He keeps it. We don't need the physical chip. Something shifted in the voice. Still calm. The calmness of a door closing. We need the access code. The encryption sequence that unlocks the documentation. You've been inside his world long enough to find it. A beat. 48 hours. After that, our patience adjusts and so do our methods. The call ended. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. The city moved outside the glass. The penthouse breathed around me. From the study I could hear, very faintly, the sound of Zenith on a call, low, even, his voice doing what it always did, containing everything. 48 hours. I thought about the folder with my father's name on the tab. I thought about a hand at the small of my back timed to the exact moment I needed it. I thought about a breath released in a hallway that didn't sound like it fit where it had been placed. I thought about "don't look at me like that" and the specific quality of control in his voice when he said it, the way it had sounded less like a command and more like a man talking himself back from an edge. And I thought about Caden. 24 years old. 2 semesters short of finishing. Not a careful man, Zenith had said, and that had been true for as long as I could remember. My brother had always been the one who opened doors before checking what was on the other side, who said yes before the offer was complete, who shook hands with gray suits in our kitchen because the alternative was unbearable and he had never learned, as I had, to sit with unbearable things quietly. He had done this for me as much as for himself. I knew that. He had pulled on the thread of the chip because he believed, with the incautious certainty of someone who loves you, that freedom was something you could simply go and get if you were brave enough to reach for it. I spent 6 hours not telling Zenith. That was its own kind of answer, and I understood it even as I moved through those hours on autopilot, through dinner, which we ate with the companionable semi-silence our evenings had evolved into, through the low conversation afterward that had nothing to do with what was happening inside my chest. I watched him across the table and thought about what the syndicate was asking for and turned it over and over looking for the version of it that didn't require me to destroy the thing I was standing on. There wasn't one. An access code. The encryption sequence. Something Zenith kept not on a device but, I had come to understand, in his mind, the kind of man who trusts nothing he can't carry inside himself. I had been inside his world long enough to have heard things, seen things, absorbed the peripheral details that accumulate when 2 people share space across weeks. Not the code itself. But perhaps the shape of where it lived. And I could not do it. I understood that somewhere in the 3rd hour and spent the remaining 3 arguing with the understanding and losing. I could not hand the syndicate what they wanted. Not because of the 17 families, not because of the federal jurisdictions, not even because of what Zenith had said the first night, that I would be dead before I reached the lobby. But because of something more immediate and more damning. Because the man across the table had paid for 8 months I thought I'd been given by medicine alone. Because he had structured it as an offset so I would not feel the weight of it. Because he had stood in enough doorways and stopped at enough thresholds that I had begun to understand it was not restraint but respect, the particular respect of someone who knows their own gravity and is careful about where they exert it. I could not betray him. Which meant I had to tell him. Which meant whatever happened to Caden next was something I had set in motion by walking into his bedroom 14 months ago and finding a chip behind a mirror, and no amount of retracing the logic of it changed where it ended. I found him in the study after midnight. He was at the desk, reading, a single lamp making a contained world of light around him. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway and read my face with the speed he read everything. He closed the book. "Tell me," he said. So I did. All of it. The call, the voice, the 48 hours. The access code. The window they believed I had. I stood in the doorway of his study in the low light and laid out the entire architecture of what I had been sitting with since 3 in the afternoon, and I watched him listen with the absolute stillness of someone receiving information they are already processing into response. When I finished, the silence lasted long enough to have weight. "You waited 6 hours," he said. "Yes." "Why?" I looked at him across the study. At the lamplit space between us that had been getting smaller in increments I hadn't chosen and couldn't reverse. "Because I was trying to find a version of this where I didn't have to tell you. Where I could handle it without," I stopped. "Without owing you another thing." Something moved through his expression. That fractional opening, deeper this time. Something that had been accumulating across weeks of doorways and low conversations and a breath in a hallway that didn't fit. "And you couldn't find it," he said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and the lamplight reorganized around him the way all light reorganized around him, as though even illumination understood the hierarchy, and he moved to the window and looked out at Chicago and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own form of answer. "They have him," I said. "Zenith. They actually have him this time. This isn't, it's not a bluff I can wait out." "I know." "Then what?" I said I know. Not sharp. Something tighter than sharp. Something that in another man would precede violence but in him preceded the specific, terrible focus of someone rearranging everything available to them into a new configuration. "Caden is still in the North Side safe house." "They're lying to you." The floor shifted. "What?" "The safe house has been compromised for 36 hours. I moved him yesterday morning." He turned from the window. "They don't have your brother, Eloan. They have a location that used to hold him and a story built on the assumption that I hadn't already anticipated the move." His eyes were very steady. "They called you because the direct approach failed. Because I didn't give them what they needed at the gala last month. Because Voss reported back that you were real and that made you the most efficient remaining pressure point." I stared at him. "He's safe," he said. "He has been safe." The relief that moved through me was so large it had no edges. It moved through my entire body and left something raw behind it, something that had been braced for catastrophe long enough that its sudden absence felt structurally dangerous. My eyes were wet before I understood they were going to be. I turned away because crying in front of Zenith Cross felt like a particular vulnerability I hadn't budgeted for, and I heard him cross the room, for steps, 5, and then his hand was at my shoulder. Not the small of my back this time. Not a performance for an audience. Just his hand. Present. Still. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly. "That he was moved." "Yes," I said. My voice was uneven. "You should have." "I know." His hand didn't move. Neither did I. Outside, Chicago held its breath. "They're going to escalate," I said, when I trusted my voice enough. "When the 48 hours pass and I don't deliver." "Yes." "So what happens now?" His hand pressed once, briefly, at my shoulder. The way he had pressed against my back in the candlelight of the dinner, weighted, deliberate, a language I had been learning the grammar of across weeks without meaning to. "Now," he said, "we stop waiting for them to move." The gown was red. Not the deep water blue of the Alderton event, not the burgundy of the dinner with Voss. Red in the way that leaves no room for interpretation, the color of a decision already made, of something that cannot be walked back. Petra had laid it out without comment, which meant Zenith had chosen it, which meant the choice was deliberate, which meant everything about tonight had been constructed with the same precision he applied to everything, and I was somewhere inside the architecture of it, load-bearing and not entirely sure of my own position. The exchange was set for 10 p.m. at the Meridian, a charity gala on the 42nd floor of a building 3 blocks east, the kind of event that provided coverage through its own grandeur. 500 people in black tie, champagne at $120 a glass, a string quartet performing in a room where several of the guests had, at various points, ordered the disappearance of other guests. The syndicate had chosen it the way predators choose open ground, visibility as camouflage, the social contract of the room as a leash on response. They had sent the location at noon. A single message, no number attached. Come alone. Bring the sequence. We'll know if you've told him. I had read it standing in the kitchen with my coffee going cold and Zenith 3 feet away at the counter reading something on his phone. I had not shown it to him. That was the arrangement we had reached in the study 2 nights ago, not in words exactly, but in the way arrangements between people who have stopped pretending reach each other. He would manage what he managed. I would go, because I was the hinge the whole thing turned on and we both understood it. Because the syndicate needed to believe I had come alone. Because the only way to end this was to let them think they had won it. I was bait. I had agreed to be bait, which was a sentence I had never anticipated constructing about myself, and yet here I was in a red gown in the back of a car moving through Chicago's Friday night with an earpiece so small it was invisible and the access code, a false one, constructed by Zenith and a man I had never met who apparently built these things for a living, memorized to the point where it lived in my mouth like language. 42nd floor, Zenith's voice said in my ear. Low. Even. The voice he used when he needed to be the steadiest thing in the room. Northeast corridor has 2 of mine already positioned. You'll see a man at the bar in a gray jacket. Don't look at him directly. I know, I said quietly, to the window, to the city moving past. When you make contact, you need 3 minutes. I know. A pause. The kind that in another context would have been nothing, but in an earpiece in the back of a car heading towards something that could end several ways, it had the density of everything unsaid across 8 weeks of closed doors and doorways and a hand that had moved from professional to something that had no professional name. Eloan. I'm all right, I said. Before he could say whatever he had been about to say. Because I needed to be all right, and saying it first made it slightly more true. Another pause. Red, he said finally. Quiet. Not quite a question. You chose it. Yes. A beat. It suits you. I looked at my hands in my lap and did not say what rose in my chest at that, which was considerable and poorly timed. The Meridian was everything the syndicate had intended it to be, overwhelming in the way only money at scale overwhelms, the kind of room that makes you feel simultaneously significant for being in it and entirely replaceable by it. Crystal and candlelight, the low orchestral hum of 500 people performing their versions of themselves. I moved through it the way Zenith had taught me without teaching me, with the specific posture of someone who belongs, which is less about confidence than about the absence of apology. I found them at 20 past 10. There were 3 of them, which I had expected. The voice from the phone belonged to a man in his 50s, silver-haired, with the careful presentation of someone who has spent decades making themselves appear reasonable. He smiled when he saw me. The smile of a man who has been right about something. You came, he said. You gave me a reason to, I said. He gestured to the 2 men flanking him, stay, and drew me toward the northeast window with the smooth social choreography of someone steering a conversation at a party. Outside, Chicago's grid glittered 42 floors below. I thought about a man standing at a different window, in a different tower, looking at this same city like it was something he was responsible for. 3 minutes. The sequence, the silver-haired man said. Still pleasant. The pleasantness of someone who has already decided what happens next regardless of what I do. I understood, in that moment, with the clarity that comes when you are standing inside a plan and can finally see its full shape, he had never intended to let me leave this building. The exchange was theater. I was not bait. I was the closing of a door. My earpiece registered the quietest sound. Not a word. Just breath, deliberate and close. I gave him the false sequence. He repeated it into his phone quietly, and the 30 seconds he spent waiting for confirmation were the longest of my life, and then something changed in his expression, not the pleasantness, which stayed, but something underneath it, something that had been waiting. "That's not it," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." The sound that followed was not one sound but several, arriving in a sequence so compressed it registered as a single event: the northeast corridor doors, the service entrance to the left, the particular organized chaos of men who have been positioned and are now moving with purpose. Gray Jacket at the bar was already no longer at the bar. The two men flanking the silver-haired man turned toward the disturbance and found, arriving from 3 directions simultaneously, the specific consequence of underestimating Zenith Cross's patience. The room fractured. Not into panic, the containment was too precise for that, but into the controlled urgency of something being surgically resolved. Security personnel who were not the building's security personnel materialized at exits. The string quartet stopped. Someone near the bar said something sharp and was swiftly managed. The silver-haired man reached for something inside his jacket. Zenith was already there. I don't know when he crossed the room. I didn't see it happen, which was consistent with everything I had learned about how he moved, not quickly exactly, but inevitably, the way gravity moves, without announcement. He was simply not there, and then he was, one hand closing over the silver-haired man's wrist with the specific economy of someone who has calculated exactly how much force the moment requires and is applying precisely that amount and not 1 ounce more. The gun did not come out of the jacket. "Carver," Zenith said. The silver-haired man's name, delivered without inflection, the way you say the name of something you have already finished deciding about. Carver looked at him with those reasonable eyes, and the pleasantness finally, fully left his face, and underneath it was just a man who had made a miscalculation and knew it. The next 4 minutes were something I will spend a long time reconstructing. Not because they were difficult to survive, Zenith's people were too precise for collateral damage, too disciplined for spectacle, but because of what it means to watch someone operate at the full scale of what they are. No performance. No management. Just the complete and terrible competence of a man in his actual element, moving through a room the way a current moves through water, purposeful and without friction. I stayed where he had positioned me, northeast window, back to the glass, a sight line to both exits, because the plan required it and because my legs had developed an opinion about movement that I respected. Shots were fired. 3, from the service entrance. Returned with precision that suggested the exchange of information had been very deliberately asymmetric. Zenith's people had known exactly where Carver's would be. A man in a dark jacket went down near the corridor door. Not dead. Managed. And then it was over. The specific silence that follows the cessation of something violent is different from other silences. It has texture. It has the held breath of a room recalibrating. 500 guests had been moved to a secondary hall by people who had presented themselves as additional security and were not, and the room we stood in now held perhaps 20 people, most of them Zeniths, and the chandelier above us swayed almost imperceptibly as though registering what had passed beneath it. Zenith crossed to me. He looked at my face first, the way he always looked at my face first, running the assessment that I had stopped finding impersonal. Then at my hands, which were shaking, which I had not given them permission to do. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. Confirmation. "Yes." My voice was steadier than my hands. He looked at me for a moment. The red gown. The city behind me. Whatever expression I was wearing that I couldn't feel the shape of. Something in his face moved through several configurations in rapid succession and settled on none of them. Then he took off his jacket, charcoal, because it was always charcoal, and placed it over my shoulders without asking, and the warmth of it, the cedar weight of it settling around me in the aftermath of all that cold and glass and controlled violence, undid something in my chest that I had been keeping carefully assembled. "Caden is being brought in," he said quietly. "He'll be at the penthouse within the hour." I nodded. My throat was doing something complicated. "Carver?" I asked. "Handled." The word closed the file. I looked at him in the low chandelier light, in the aftermath of everything, wearing his jacket over a red gown in a room that smelled of gunpowder and $120 champagne, and I thought about a chip behind a mirror and a gray suit at a kitchen table and 8 months my father had lived that I had credited to medicine. "You were in the room the whole time," I said. "Northeast corridor." A pause. I was never going to let it go further than it went. "You could have stopped it before." "No," he said. "They needed to believe it was real until it wasn't." "So did you." Something moved through his eyes. "I'm sorry for that." I had not heard him apologize for anything before. The words sat in the air between us differently than his other words. "Unarmored." "Zenith," I said. "Don't," he said quietly. The same word he'd used in the hallway outside his study. "Don't look at me like that." "I'm not," I said. "I'm looking at you like this." Whatever this was. Whatever expression I was wearing that I still couldn't feel the shape of but understood, in the deep water way you understand things that have been true for longer than you've admitted them, was not something I was going to be able to take back. He looked at me for a long moment. The chandelier swayed. Chicago glittered. He reached up and adjusted the jacket on my shoulders with 2 fingers, the same gesture he had made with the gown's neckline before the Voss dinner, that particular, precise touch at the edge of something, and this time he didn't withdraw immediately. This time his hand stayed. They released Caden at 11:47. I know the exact time because I watched the clock on the penthouse wall with the focused attention of someone who needs something concrete to track while everything else is too large and too formless to hold. He came through the suite door with 2 of Zenith's men flanking him, not restraining, flanking, the distinction mattering more than it might have a week ago, and he looked thinner than I remembered and older in the specific way that fear ages people, around the eyes, at the corners of the mouth. He saw me and stopped. "L," he said. Just that. My name the way only Caden says it, compressed and relieved and guilty all at once. I crossed the room and held my brother for a long time without saying anything, because there was too much to say and the order of it hadn't arranged itself yet, and some things are better held than spoken until you know which words are actually true. He was solid and real and smelled of somewhere unfamiliar, and I pressed my face against his shoulder and understood, in the way you understand things when the emergency is finally over, how afraid I had been. Zenith was not in the room. I noticed his absence the way I had started noticing all his absences, as a specific quality of space, a particular atmospheric adjustment, the room slightly larger and quieter than it needed to be. I had seen him briefly after the gala, in the organized aftermath of Carver's extraction and the systematic departure of 20 men who moved like they had done this before, which they had. He had spoken to 3 people in rapid succession, his jacket still on my shoulders, and then looked at me once, that assessment, that landing, and said someone would bring Caden in within the hour and I should eat something. I had not eaten anything. Caden and I sat on the window seat until past 1 in the morning. He talked. I listened. The story of the last weeks came out in the halting, non-linear way of someone who has been alone with it too long. The contact he'd made, the people who had seemed legitimate, the moment he'd understood they weren't, the room, the waiting, the particular psychological texture of being held by people who were always pleasant and never reassuring. He apologized 3 times. I told him to stop. He apologized once more, because he was Caden, and then we sat in silence for a while and watched Chicago do its patient nocturnal breathing. "He's not what I expected," Caden said finally. "No," I said. He's not. My brother looked at me with the particular attention of someone who has known your face their entire life and can read its frequencies. Don't, I said. I'm not saying anything. You're about to. He was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? I looked at the city. At the grid of lights that I had been looking at for 2 months from this window and had stopped seeing as alien and started seeing as mine, which was its own kind of answer. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Caden left at 2. One of Zenith's people drove him to the north side apartment that had been arranged, temporary, safe, a place to land while the remaining pieces were managed. I stood at the suite door and watched him go and felt the particular, complicated relief of someone setting down something heavy, mixed with the particular, complicated awareness that the thing I was about to turn back toward was heavier still, and I had chosen it. I found Zenith's note on the kitchen counter. Lakefront. When you're ready. Z. No address. As though there were only one place on the lakefront that could be meant, which, for a man who owned this much of the city's skyline, was probably true. The car was waiting without being called. The wind off Lake Michigan at 3 in the morning is a different animal than the city's wind. It moves without apology, without the buildings to break it, carrying the cold of deep water and open distance, the smell of something that has traveled further than Chicago and will continue past it. I stood at the railing with my coat pulled close. His jacket had been replaced, at some point in the night's logistics, by my own, and found him exactly where I knew I would find him. He was facing the water. He didn't turn when I approached, but his shoulders registered it, that minute adjustment, the cable under different load. I stood beside him at the railing and looked at the lake, which at this hour was black and enormous and indifferent in the way of all things large enough to have no opinion of you. For a while neither of us spoke, and the silence was the companionable kind, the kind that has stopped requiring management. He reached into his jacket pocket. The chip was smaller than I remembered. Obsidian casing, unremarkable against his palm. He held it for a moment, looking at it with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then he set it on the railing between us. The documentation on this drive, he said, has been replicated to 3 encrypted servers in jurisdictions that would take the syndicate a decade to access. Carver's network is finished regardless of what exists on this chip. He looked at the water. It's no longer leverage. Over anyone. I looked at the chip on the railing. At the thing I had reached for in a bedroom 8 weeks ago with shaking hands and a plan that had lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then why? Because it's yours, he said simply. It was the reason you came. The reason your family is bound to mine. He paused. I'm releasing the debt. The wind moved between us. The 2.3 million, I said. Cleared. The service arrangement is dissolved. Your brother owes nothing. You owe nothing. He said it without ceremony, the way he did everything that mattered, plainly, without staging, as though the absence of theater was its own form of respect. You're free to leave, Eloan. Tonight. With Caden, with whatever you want to take. There is a car, an account, Stop, I said. He stopped. I picked up the chip. Turned it once between my fingers the way I had seen him turn it, in this same hand, in a bedroom that now felt like a different country. I looked at it for a moment, at the small, dark, ordinary-looking thing that had cost so much, and then I set it back down on the railing and looked at him. He was already looking at me. He had been looking at me the way he looked at everything he was trying to understand, completely, quietly, without letting the looking become a demand. What happens to the estate? I asked. Without the debt. It continues, he said. As it was. And you? A pause. As I was. That's not what I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. The lake moved behind him. The city glittered behind me. We were between them, between water and light, between the life I had come from and the one I had been living without deciding to, and the wind was very cold and he was very still, and I understood that this was the moment he had built with more care than anything, the clean exit, the open door, the arrangement that left me owing nothing and wanting nothing and free in the specific, terrible way that removes all excuses. He had given me every reason to go. You paid for 8 months with my father, I said quietly. You moved my brother before I asked you to. You put me in a red dress and stood in a northeast corridor and called it a plan. I looked at him. You have been, for 2 months, in your completely maddening, doorway standing, never crossing way, taking care of me. And you're doing it right now. This. I gestured at the chip, the railing, the 3 a.m. lakefront. This is you taking care of me. Something moved through his face. Deep and unreversed. Eloan. I'm not leaving, I said. The wind moved. You should understand what staying means, he said. His voice was low. Careful. The voice he used when something required more precision than usual, when the stakes of imprecision were too high. This life. What it asks. What it costs. His eyes were very steady. I am not a simple man too. I know what you are, I said. I've had 2 months to study you at close range. And? I looked at him across the railing. At the man who stood in doorways and paid debts in secret and chose red because it suited me and was standing here at 3 in the morning giving me the chip and the car and the account and the open door because he would rather lose than have me stay for the wrong reasons. And, I said, you are considerably more than the thing you show people. The silence that followed was the longest he had ever given me. Then he reached across the railing, very slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has stopped at enough thresholds to understand the weight of crossing one, and his hand covered mine where it rested on the cold metal. Not taking. Not directing. Just there. Present. The way he had stood in the northeast corridor, positioned, still, committed. If you stay, he said quietly, there's no chip. No debt. No arrangement. His thumb moved once across my hand. Just this. I know, I said. It's enough? I turned my hand beneath his. Let my fingers close around his. Felt him go very still in the way he went still when something required all of him to hold. It's everything, I said. The lake moved. The city held its breath. The chip sat on the railing between 2 people who had stopped being what they were to each other at the beginning, creditor and debtor, keeper and kept, the man who decided things and the woman working off what her family owed, and had become, somewhere in the accumulated weight of closed doors and low conversations and a breath in a hallway that never fit back in its place, something that had no contract. Something chosen. He didn't kiss me on the lakefront. That wasn't how he was built, and I had learned the grammar of him well enough to know that the gesture was already made, in the hand, in the thumb's single movement, in the standing there at 3 in the morning in the cold because he had wanted me to have the real choice and could not give it to me anywhere that felt like his. He picked up the chip with his free hand. Looked at it once. And dropped it into the lake. It made almost no sound. Just a small, dark disappearance into black water. Come home, he said. And I did.